I came home to find it lying right there, an old dictaphone, resting on my doorstep like an unexpected guest. No note, no explanation. I thought it might be from a neighbor, maybe a weird prank or a lost package, but there was no address attached, nothing that could tell me where it came from. The device looked aged, with scratches along its plastic body, as if it had passed through too many careless hands. Against my better judgment, I took it inside. Later that evening, curiosity got the best of me. I sat at the kitchen table, lit by the dull yellow glow of the overhead lamp, and pressed play. The faint hiss of static greeted me first, followed by indistinct chatter, two voices, their conversation muffled. Then I heard it, my name, and not just my name, but things about me no one else could know, details about my work, frustrations I had shared only in my head, and even specifics about that weird dream I had the night before. A chill ran down my spine as I continued to listen. The voices, still calm, still too familiar, discussed me like I was some case to be solved, a subject to be analyzed. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just some strange coincidence, maybe an elaborate prank. But the longer I listened, the more the details aligned too perfectly, matching every fragment of my life with unsettling precision. The conversation on the tape shifted. One voice said something I couldn't quite catch, and then, clear as day, came a knock. A hard, hollow knock on the recording 3 times in quick succession. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze. Then in real life, I heard it, knock, knock, knock. It came from my front door. The same rhythm, the same sound. My hands trembled as I stopped the recording, the silence in my kitchen now too thick, too oppressive. For a moment, I sat paralyzed, unable to move, every muscle locked in place. My heart hammered so loudly, I thought it might give me away. Swallowing hard, I rose from my chair, every step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. The air around me seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I could feel sweat trickling down my back as I reached the door and gripped the handle with shaking fingers. I opened it. A man stood on the other side, tall and unremarkable except for the way his eyes locked onto mine. Like he already knew me, knew everything about me. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself. His stare was a weight I couldn't escape. "I know your secrets," he said, voice steady and deliberate, as if it were just a fact, something neither of us could dispute. His presence felt suffocating, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still standing there or trapped inside the recorded conversation I had just heard. Before I could react, he turned and walked away into the night, leaving me alone with questions that felt heavier than the silence he left behind. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging me out of a restless sleep. I squinted at the unfamiliar number glowing on the screen. I figured it was a wrong number and let it ring out. Then it happened again the next night, and the next. Each time it was the same. No message, no words, just silence on the other end. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint breathing, barely audible over the soft hum of the line. But maybe that was just my imagination, fueled by the growing unease that kept me awake long after the calls ended. Soon, it wasn't just at night. The calls came at random times, mid-morning, in the middle of dinner, during meetings at work. Each time, my phone screen lit up with the same unknown number. I told myself it was probably just a telemarketer. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The silence on the other end wasn't passive. It felt intentional, like someone was waiting for something. After a week, I started to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. It was just this gnawing sense that I wasn't alone, even when no one else was around. Walking home from work, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder. At the grocery store, my skin prickled as if someone's eyes were on me. Every shadow seemed heavier than before. Then one night after the 5th call that day, I finally decided to call the number back. It was a mistake, but by that point, I needed answers more than I needed to feel safe. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as I was about to hang up, the line clicked, and what I heard next made my stomach drop. It was my own voice on the other end. I sat frozen as my own voice, cold, distant, spoke words I had never said aloud but recognized all too well. It recited my home address, my work schedule, the route I took every day, even the small details I had thought were private. How I liked my coffee, the names of my neighbors' pets, the broken latch on my apartment window. And then it spoke my name slowly, as if savoring it. I hung up, my breath hitching. My hands shook violently as I stared at my phone screen, feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from under me. How is this possible? How could someone know all that? I checked the call log, hoping I had imagined it all. But the number was there, mocking me. It wasn't just information. It was personal, intimate. Someone had been watching, learning, and waiting. The next day, my front door was unlocked when I came home from work. I knew I had locked it before leaving. My apartment looked untouched, but I felt it. Someone had been inside. My laptop charger was slightly uncoiled, my shoes out of place by just an inch. It was the kind of shift only I would notice, something meant just for me. I went to the police, desperate for help, but they shrugged it off. Probably a prank, they said, but it didn't feel like a prank. That night, I received one final call. I let it ring, my heart pounding. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I stood frozen in my darkened apartment. Every sound outside the window magnified, every creak of the floorboards sending cold dread through me. The voicemail came in moments later. I waited a long time before pressing play, hoping against hope that it would be empty silence again. It wasn't. It was my voice again, this time soft, almost affectionate. I'll see you soon. We weren't expecting to find anything, maybe just the cracked paint of an old wall. Instead, there were drawings, childish sketches scrawled in thick crayon, spiraling across the plaster beneath. At first, it seemed innocent enough, smiling stick figures, a crooked sun in the corner, a house with a bright red door. But the more we uncovered, the stranger it became. The drawings seemed to change, growing more erratic as they continued. A figure appeared in the background, just a black scribble at first, barely noticeable. But with every new patch we uncovered, it grew larger, closer. It wasn't smiling. We thought it was just some strange relic left behind by a previous family. Something old, forgotten. But every morning, there were more drawings. Fresh ones. We never heard anyone enter. We were the only ones living in the house. Or at least, that's what we believed. One day, I found a new picture by the bedroom door. It was drawn hastily, the lines sharp and aggressive. The figure was there again, this time at the foot of our bed, staring at two stick figures that looked like us. I tried to laugh it off, but something in the back of my mind gnawed at me. It wasn't just a coincidence, was it? My wife suggested we repaint the walls, but by then, it felt like covering them would only make things worse. It felt like ignoring a message, one we didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. Every night, I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and still, the drawings appeared. We decided to install cameras. I thought it would give us some peace of mind, maybe even catch whoever was sneaking in. I wasn't ready for what the footage would show. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, the drawings returned. Fresh spirals of black and red on the living room wall. I stayed up late, reviewing the footage, expecting to see some intruder. But there was no one. No sign of a break-in, no shadow slipping through a door or window. Just the empty house, silent and still. Then, in the third night's footage, I saw him. A man, thin and hunched, slithering from the attic hatch in the ceiling like a shadow slipping from a crack. He moved with eerie familiarity, stepping lightly across the floor as if he knew exactly where to go. He carried crayons in one hand, dragging them along the wall, adding new lines to the drawings. When he was done, he stood back, tilting his head as if admiring his work. Then, without a sound, he climbed back up into the ceiling and vanished. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I turned off the camera feed, the room around me closing in like a vice. This man wasn't just sneaking into the house. He'd been living here watching us. He knew us. He knew exactly where we slept, where we moved, what we ignored. The police found a nest of sorts in the attic, a pile of blankets, food wrappers, and a box of crayons. He had been living there for months, coming down at night to draw on the walls, to mark his presence in a way that only we would understand. They told us he was homeless, likely disturbed, someone who had lost his grip on reality. But the drawings weren't random. They were deliberate, portraits of us, our lives, our routines, as if he was trying to become a part of our world. We moved out the next morning, but sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring at the walls of our new place, wondering if he's out there somewhere. Arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between bills and grocery ads. No return address, no name, just a blank envelope, sealed tight, with my name carefully printed on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence. "I know what you did." I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, a strange prank, but then more letters followed. Each one grew more pointed, more personal. Some mentioned things I hadn't told anyone, private conversations, mistakes from years ago, regrets I had buried deep. They arrived daily, always in the same blank envelope, always the same neat handwriting. The town was small, and our local postman was the only one who delivered the mail. He'd been doing the route for years, John, with his easy smile and worn-out cap. When I asked him about the letters, he only shrugged. "I just deliver what's in the bag," he said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl, but I didn't press him further. At night, I started hearing things. A shuffle outside the door, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I'd rush to the window, but there was never anyone there. Just the faint echo of someone moving away. Then came the worst letter, one that simply read, "I'll be watching tonight." I sat in my living room that night. Every light turned on, the doors double-locked, pretending to read a book while my heart thundered in my chest. Every creak of the old house made my pulse race. Hours passed and nothing happened. No visitors, no disturbances. I thought maybe the letter was just meant to scare me. The next morning, another letter arrived. It was short. "Did you sleep well?" The walls felt like they were closing in. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I decided to follow the postman, John, the next time he did his rounds. If anyone could tell me who was sending the letters, it had to be him. The following night, I waited until the sun dipped low, the streets emptying out. I saw him, a silhouette under the glow of a street lamp, delivering mail far too late. He moved differently at night, quieter, more deliberate. I followed from a distance, keeping to the shadows as he made his way down the quiet streets, slipping letters into mailboxes one by one. He didn't follow the usual route. Instead, he stopped at homes that had no deliveries listed that day, only the blank envelopes, identical to mine. I watched as he placed one into a neighbor's mailbox and then another down the street. His movements were quick, practiced. It was no accident. John was delivering these letters himself. I stepped closer, the damp night air thick in my lungs, until I was close enough to see his face under the dim streetlights. There was no smile now, just a sharp, bitter focus. He muttered under his breath as he dropped the letters, his hands moving in stiff, angry motions. Suddenly, as if sensing me, he looked up. Our eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the friendly grin I had known for years. It was something darker, a grin stretched too tight, filled with something simmering beneath the surface. A look that chilled me to the bone. He didn't say a word, just turned back to his route as if nothing had happened. I knew then that the letters weren't about me, not really. They were about him, some grudge, some long-forgotten vendetta he carried against this town. He wasn't just a postman. He was a man with a score to settle, one letter at a time. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. By morning, I packed my things and left town without a goodbye. But sometimes when the mail comes, I still hesitate before opening the box. I can't help but wonder if one day I'll find another blank envelope waiting for me, reminding me that no matter where I go, John hasn't forgotten. Barely noticeable at first, just a faint vibration beneath the soles of our boots as we worked on the construction site, digging up old asphalt to make way for new foundations. We thought it was just machinery humming somewhere in the distance, until it wasn't. By the third day, the hum had grown louder, a deep, unsettling noise that came from directly below us. It seemed to pulse, rising and falling like a heartbeat buried in the earth. At first, we joked about it, saying it was probably a broken water main or some old forgotten utility line. But the sound didn't stop. It only got worse. Then, one afternoon, we struck metal. The backhoe's bucket clanged hard against something solid. And when we pulled it up, there was an iron hatch embedded deep in the ground, its surface rusted and scratched. None of it made sense. There was no record of any structure beneath this site. The foreman wanted to leave it alone, said it wasn't part of the project. But curiosity got the better of us. We pried the hatch open with crowbars, the rusted metal groaning as it gave way. Beneath the hatch was a set of stairs, leading down into the darkness. A cold, stale breeze blew up from below, carrying with it the faint stench of chemicals and decay. We shouldn't have gone down. I knew that the moment I saw the others hesitate at the edge of the opening. But we went anyway. The stairs led to a basement, one that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The walls were lined with old shelves and equipment, all of it covered in a thick layer of dust. There were papers scattered across the floor, blueprints, charts, photographs of strange experiments I didn't understand. Then I saw the cages. They were small, built into the walls, too small for animals, too crude for anything good. Some were empty. Others held things I couldn't bear to look at for long, things that looked human or used to be twisted beyond recognition. The hum was louder down there, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It felt alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. One of the workers found a control panel and flipped a switch. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed to life overhead, revealing more of the room. And that's when we saw the door. It was a thick metal slab at the far end of the basement, bolted shut from the outside. Something about it felt wrong, as if whatever was behind it had been locked away for a reason. One of the guys reached for the bolts, but I stopped him. Every instinct in me screamed not to open it. Then we heard the noise, a sharp, metallic scrape from the other side of the door, followed by a low growl. Not a machine, not an echo, something alive. We ran. We scrambled back up the stairs, our boots slamming against the metal steps. The hatch slammed shut behind us with a thunderous clang, as if the earth itself was eager to seal it away again. We covered the hole as quickly as we could, piling dirt and rubble over it until it disappeared beneath the surface. We never told anyone what we found down there. The foreman warned us that if we mentioned it, we'd lose our jobs, and maybe more than that. Some things, he said, are better left buried. The hum stopped after that, but the silence it left behind was worse. Every time I step onto that site, I can feel it. Something still waiting beneath the dirt, something we disturbed but didn't release. I try not to think about the door, but I do. I think about it every time I feel the ground shift beneath my feet. And every time, I wonder, what if it wasn't locked to keep people out? What if it was locked to keep something in? Box left on my doorstep. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a delicate silver bracelet. It sparkled under the soft light from my hallway, intricate patterns etched along each link. There was no note, nothing to explain where it had come from or who had sent it. I should have left it alone, but curiosity, or maybe something worse, pulled me in. I slipped it onto my wrist. It felt cold at first, heavy like it didn't quite belong there. But it fit perfectly, almost too perfectly. I thought maybe it was from an old friend, someone sending a belated birthday gift. Then the accident started. The first was a minor thing, just a close call while crossing the street, a car's brakes squealing as it stopped inches from me. The next day, my phone slipped from my hand at work, shattering on the concrete floor. It felt like the universe was suddenly working against me in small, insidious ways. But it wasn't until the night my apartment door clicked open, when I knew for certain I had locked it, that I realized something wasn't right. I searched the place from top to bottom, but nothing was missing, nothing seemed out of place. It was like someone had been inside and left without touching a thing, just a reminder that they could. I tried to take the bracelet off after that. The clasp wouldn't budge. I yanked and twisted, but it stayed locked around my wrist as if fused to my skin. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a pair of scissors, trying to cut through the metal, but it didn't even scratch. The harder I pulled, the tighter it seemed to grip, as if the bracelet was alive, feeding off my fear. I started to notice things, small shifts in my environment, things I couldn't explain, objects moving just slightly from where I left them. My keys on the floor when I was sure I'd left them on the counter. My computer open to messages I didn't remember typing. And always the bracelet on my wrist, cold and unyielding. Then came the messages. At first, they were just text, short, strange phrases from an unknown number. You look beautiful today. How was the cafe? Innocuous on the surface, but they hit me like punches to the gut. Whoever sent them knew where I had been, what I was wearing, who I had seen. I stopped going out, convinced I was being followed. But the messages didn't stop. One evening, out of desperation, I took my phone to a tech friend. He ran some diagnostics and found something, a small, embedded tracker linked to the bracelet. It was subtle, sophisticated. He stared at the readout, his brow furrowed. Someone's been monitoring you, he said quietly, scrolling through the data. This thing is tracking everything. Your location, your phone, even your calls. My skin went cold. It wasn't just a gift. It was a trap. That night, I smashed the bracelet with a hammer, over and over until the delicate silver shattered into pieces. But the messages didn't stop. The next morning, there was another one waiting for me. Why did you break it? We're not done yet. Then I saw him. I was heading to my car when I spotted him across the street. My ex, standing under the streetlight with a smile that froze me in place. It had been months since I'd blocked him, since I told him I never wanted to see him again. And now here he was, because of the bracelet. He had been following me, tracking me, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life. The accidents, the strange messages, they were all him. I called the police, but the restraining order only offered so much protection. Even when he disappeared again, I knew he was still out there, somewhere, watching. Every time I hear a text notification, I feel the familiar knot of dread in my stomach. Because he found me once, and something tells me he won't stop until he finds me again. Worn-out practice books and crumpled concert programs. A handwritten composition, the paper yellowed at the edges, the ink faint but still legible. There was no title, no name, just notes scrawled across the staves in a rushed hand. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. It felt out of place among my collection, like it had been waiting there for me to find it. Curious, I sat down at the piano and began to play. The melody was simple but haunting, each note tugging at a memory I couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the tune knew me in a way nothing else ever had. By the second page, I started to feel it, a weight settling on my chest, slow and suffocating. My fingers faltered over the keys, but I pressed on, compelled by the need to reach the end. The room grew colder, the air thick with an inexplicable heaviness, as though the music itself was drawing something out of me. When the last note faded, a strange exhaustion hit me like a wave. I slumped against the piano, breathing hard, my heart racing as if I had just run a marathon. Something about that melody clung to me, like a shadow that wouldn't lift. That night, the dream started. In them, I was always in a dark room, the same tune playing softly in the background. I'd hear faint whispers, indistinct words, looping over and over, just out of reach. Every time I tried to move closer, the whispers would stop, and I'd wake up gasping, the melody still ringing in my ears. The dreams became harder to shake, bleeding into my waking hours. I'd catch myself humming the tune under my breath without realizing it, my fingers twitching in time with the rhythm. At work, at the store, even during conversations, the notes seemed to follow me, crawling into every quiet moment, filling the gaps with their haunting refrain. Then I noticed something strange. There were markings on the sheet music, tiny letters scattered among the notes, as if someone had hidden words within the composition. I spent hours decoding them, my hands trembling as the message took shape. It wasn't just a melody. It was a map. The message pointed to a specific location in the city, an abandoned theater, long forgotten and boarded up. I knew I shouldn't go, but the melody had already taken root inside me, pulling me toward it like a magnet. I needed to know what was waiting at the end of the music. I arrived just before dusk. The theater loomed in front of me, its windows shattered, the doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. The air inside was stale and cold, and every step echoed too loudly in the empty space. In the center of the stage, tucked beneath a pile of old props, I found what the music had led me to. A journal, its pages brittle, filled with frantic handwriting. The entries detailed a crime, a death that had been covered up, the truth buried along with the victim. And as I read, my blood ran cold. The victim's name was someone I knew, someone I had met only briefly but couldn't forget. The message in the music wasn't just a warning. It was a confession left by the person responsible, someone who was still out there, watching and waiting for anyone who got too close. I tried to leave, but I wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed from the back of the theater, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each step. I froze, the journal clutched tight in my hands, my heart pounding against my ribs. The melody drifted back into my mind, unbidden and unstoppable, filling the silence with its haunting refrain. And as I turned toward the sound of the footsteps, I knew one thing for certain. I had played the wrong song. And now, someone knew I had found the truth. I found a diary tucked between the seats on the bus, its cover, worn soft with age. It shouldn't have caught my attention, but something about it made me pause. It was plain, no lock, no name, just a simple leather-bound book filled with cramped handwriting. I took it home, telling myself I'd drop it off at the lost and found later. But that night, I couldn't resist. I flipped through the pages, curious to see what secrets it held. At first, it seemed ordinary, small entries about daily routines, conversations, mundane moments. But soon, the entries became unsettlingly familiar. They weren't just anyone's stories. They were mine. The handwriting described things I had done in perfect detail, small, insignificant moments I had forgotten myself. Every conversation, every thought, every decision, laid out in ink as if someone had been following me. The deeper I read, the colder the room seemed to grow. It was as if the pages knew me better than I knew myself. The most recent entry was from the day before. It described my morning exactly, the brand of cereal I ate, the time I left for work, the song I hummed without thinking. My throat tightened as I read the last line. He finds the diary on the bus. He takes it home. The words blurred on the page as panic set in. I flipped forward to the next blank section, my hands trembling. And there, on the next line, was today's entry, written in real time, as if someone was watching me at that very moment. He sits at his desk, reading this, heart pounding in his chest. He realizes now that someone is close. I slammed the diary shut, my breath coming fast. How could this be happening? No one had been in my apartment, at least not that I knew of, but the entries were too precise to dismiss. Every mundane detail was perfectly recorded, leaving me feeling exposed in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, but the diary wouldn't leave me alone. I found myself checking it constantly throughout the day, waiting to see what new words would appear. And each time, the diary seemed one step ahead, chronicling events that hadn't even happened yet. Then, a new entry appeared. It was only a single line, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. Tomorrow, he will run, but it won't matter. I knew then that whoever had written the diary wasn't just watching. They were playing a game, and I was already losing. I tried to destroy it. I tore out pages, burned the cover, tossed the ashes into the trash. But when I came back into the room, there it was sitting neatly on my desk, whole again. The next morning, the diary had one more entry. He leaves the apartment at 9:15. Someone will be waiting. I didn't want to go outside, but it felt like I had no choice. I couldn't stay inside, not with the knowledge that the diary would keep writing, no matter what I did. So I stepped out into the cold morning, my eyes darting to every passerby, every parked car. Anyone could be the one watching me. I made it halfway down the street before I saw him. He wasn't hiding, just standing there at the corner, holding a second, identical diary in his hands. His eyes met mine, and he smiled. Without a word, he held the book out toward me. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Just a narrow path that branched off the main trail, winding deeper into the forest where the trees grew thicker and the light struggled to reach the ground. We hesitated at first, but something about it pulled us in. It looked worn, like it had been used recently, but by who or what? We couldn't tell. There was no sign, no markers, just a faint outline of footsteps pressed into the soft dirt. The first hour felt normal enough. We laughed, joked about finding a hidden treasure, and let the trail lead us deeper into the woods. The air was cool, and the canopy above blocked most of the sky, giving everything a quiet, dreamlike feel. But soon, the path began to change. The trees pressed in tighter, their branches hanging low like they wanted to snag us. The ground grew uneven, and the soft dirt became tangled with roots that seemed determined to trip us up. We checked the compass, north and east. The needle spun wildly, unable to settle. We should have turned back then. But the deeper we went, the harder it became to stop. The forest around us grew quieter, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our own footsteps, crunching over fallen leaves. Every now and then, I'd glance back, certain I saw movement in the trees, only to find nothing but shadows shifting in the undergrowth. By the time we realized we were lost, it was too late. The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't looking, twisting the path into a maze that made no sense. Even the sun seemed wrong, hanging low in the sky, as if it hadn't moved for hours. The first sign that something was off came when we found the backpack. It was old, weathered, the fabric bleached from years of sun and rain. But it hadn't been there when we first passed through. Inside were strange things, rusted tools, a tattered notebook filled with illegible scribbles, and a photograph of a group of hikers. They looked just like us. We didn't speak after that. Every rustle in the underbrush set our nerves on edge. We walked faster, each of us too scared to admit that something wasn't right, that we weren't alone out here. The trail kept looping back to places we'd already seen. Tree stumps, twisted roots, strange clusters of stones that felt oddly deliberate. Then we found our own footprints, scattered across the trail, along with the same damaged backpack we had left behind only hours earlier. But this time, the notebook inside was missing. We kept moving, our breath shallow, hearts racing. The forest felt alive, shifting around us, closing in. I thought I heard something, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. But when I turned, nothing was there, just the trees, still and silent. By the time we stumbled back to where we had started, it was nearly dusk. Our gear was scattered on the ground. Our backpacks ripped open, supplies scattered, as if someone had gone through them. And then I saw it, a second set of footprints circling our belongings, trailing off into the woods. I don't know how we got out. The trail led us back somehow, but not without leaving its mark. Even now, I still wake up some nights with the smell of damp earth filling my nose, convinced I'm back on that path, lost in a forest that refuses to let me go. And sometimes, when I'm out walking, far from any woods or trails, I still hear it, a soft rustling, just behind me like someone following. The light had been perfect, painting the landscape in soft oranges and deep purples. But when I looked at the picture later, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the frame, a man in a dark jacket, his head lowered, barely visible among the shadows of the trees. I didn't remember anyone being there when I took the shot. It unsettled me, but I told myself it was probably a stranger passing by, a coincidence. Still, I couldn't stop staring at the photo, the way his figure blended perfectly into the shadows, as if he belonged there. I moved on, taking more photos over the next few days. Portraits, street shots, candid moments, all normal until I reviewed them later. The same man was in each photo, always in the background, always half hidden. Sometimes he was sitting on a distant bench, other times leaning against a wall or standing just out of focus behind a crowd. It was like a game of hide and seek, except I hadn't been playing. By the fourth or fifth photo, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The angles didn't make sense. He was in places I hadn't even noticed when I took the pictures, places I knew should have been empty. And the worst part, he was getting closer. In the next batch of photos, his face began to appear, blurred but unmistakable. A thin, pale face with eyes that looked straight into the camera. Not at the scene, not at the surroundings, just directly at me, as if he knew I would find him there. I stopped taking pictures after that. It didn't feel safe anymore, but the unease followed me everywhere. I started seeing him outside of the photos, just glimpses at first. A shape in the reflection of a store window, a figure standing too far down the street to make out clearly. Whenever I turned to look, he was gone, slipping back into the periphery. I combed through the photos again, zooming in on his face, hoping for answers. That's when I saw something that froze me in place. In the reflection of his eyes, faint but unmistakable, was my face, the reflection from the exact moment I had taken the photo. Somehow, he had seen me before I even knew he was there. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just a trick of light, some quirk of the lens. But the next time I picked up my camera, I felt him before I saw him. I raised the camera instinctively, snapping a shot without thinking. And there he was standing just outside my apartment window, watching me from the street below. I pulled the curtains shut, heart pounding, but I knew it wouldn't stop him. He wasn't just a figure in the background anymore. He was close now, too close. I stopped going outside, hoping the distance would break whatever connection I had with him. But even when I stayed in, the photos kept changing. Old shots I had taken months ago, ones that had been clear before, now had him in them, as if he had been following me all along, quietly slipping into my life without my knowing. And then this morning, a new photograph appeared on my phone. I hadn't taken it. It showed me, sitting at my desk, holding the camera, staring down at the screen. I dropped the phone and bolted to the door, but before I reached it, I heard the soft click of a camera shutter from just behind me. I wasn't even supposed to be there. Just a late meeting that ran too long, followed by a sprint through the dark station. The platform was deserted, the night air thick with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you've missed something important. The train pulled in without a sound. No announcements, no rush of passengers. The doors slid open quietly, as if it had been waiting just for me. I stepped inside, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting the car in a pale, sickly glow. The seats were mostly empty, scattered with a few passengers who sat too still, their faces turned away from me. I found a seat near the middle of the car and settled in, catching my breath. The train jerked forward, and I watched the station slip away into the night. Outside the windows, the city faded quickly, giving way to empty streets and darkened fields. But something felt off almost immediately. The train didn't stop. It blew past the next station, then the one after that. I sat up confused, checking the map above the windows. The stations we passed didn't match any I'd ever seen before. Names that felt old, almost unfamiliar, like they belonged to a different time. I told myself it was just a late-night route, one I hadn't taken before. Maybe I'd missed some schedule update. But the train kept moving, gliding through the dark, far past where the city should have ended. The other passengers didn't react at all. They sat like statues, their faces turned toward the windows, as if the passing scenery meant something only they could understand. I tried not to panic, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became to breathe normally. The air felt too heavy, the silence too thick. The only sound was the faint hum of the train and the occasional shudder as it sped through empty, unlit stations. I glanced at the man sitting across from me. He hadn't moved once since I boarded, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. When I leaned in slightly, I noticed something strange. He wasn't blinking. I tried to get someone's attention, but no one looked at me. The woman, too, rows down, had her hands clutched tight around her purse, her knuckles white, her lips pressed shut as if holding back a scream. I realized then that she was just as terrified as I was. I stood up, moving toward the door that connected to the next car. But when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, feeling the sweat start to bead along my forehead. The door was locked, trapping me inside with these silent, unmoving passengers. I turned back toward my seat, and that's when I noticed the man across from me had shifted. He was staring at me now, his eyes glassy, his mouth curled into a small, unsettling smile. I sat down quickly, trying to avoid his gaze. The train sped up, the vibrations shaking through the floor, and the windows showed nothing but endless black fields, dotted with distant shapes I couldn't quite make out. And then the train slowed. The brakes hissed, and the car jolted as we pulled into a small station. Not one listed on any map, just a slab of concrete under a broken sign, half covered in ivy. The doors slid open, and I felt every muscle in my body tense. No one got off. No one got on, except for one man. He stepped through the door from the next car, tall and thin, with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was calm, too calm, like he knew exactly where we were going. He scanned the car slowly, and when his eyes met mine, I knew this wasn't a normal passenger. He walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. Without a word, he set the duffel bag down at my feet and nodded, as if passing off a burden I didn't ask for. Then he turned around and stepped off the train, disappearing into the dark. The doors slid shut. The train lurched forward again, picking up speed. No one moved. No one asked questions. I stared at the bag, heart racing, terrified to open it, but knowing I couldn't leave it untouched. I reached down, unzipping the top slowly. Inside were clothes, a few personal belongings, and a photograph. It was a picture of me, sitting on that same train car, looking exactly as I did now. Behind me, blurred in the background, was the man who had just left. The train kept moving, speeding toward an unknown destination. The map overhead flickered, new stations appearing, stations with names I didn't recognize, names that felt more like warnings than places. I knew then there was no way off this train. Not anymore. It's quiet work, the kind that makes the world feel smaller when the streets are empty and only the night owls are listening. I liked the solitude of it, until the call started. At first, it was just background noise, a strange hum bleeding into the airwaves, soft enough to ignore. I figured it was a technical glitch, old equipment playing tricks. But then came the first call. The line crackled as I answered it, standard procedure for our live call-in segment. But all I heard was breathing, slow and deliberate, just on the edge of the microphone. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Nothing, just that heavy, measured breath, as if the caller knew I couldn't hang up right away. The silence stretched longer than I was comfortable with before they disconnected. It became routine. The calls came every night, always at different times. A click, a pause, and then the breathing. It never lasted more than a few seconds, but it was enough to rattle me, enough to make the booth feel smaller, more suffocating. I told myself it was a prank, someone bored, someone who liked knowing they had an audience. But soon, the messages became more specific. Between the records, callers would leave strange phrases, words that sounded more like personal warnings than requests. "You shouldn't leave alone tonight. Check the side door, it's unlocked." I stopped playing them on air, too unsettled to make sense of them. Still, I couldn't stop the messages from coming. They always knew things they shouldn't. Tiny details, like the song I'd listened to on the way to the studio, or the coffee shop where I'd stopped earlier that day. I tried blocking the number, but it didn't matter. Every time I traced the calls, they came from a different place. A payphone on one street, an abandoned office building the next. No pattern, no connection. Just an ever-tightening grip, closing in around me. One night, I stayed after the show, hoping to catch whoever was behind it. The station was empty, the building dark except for the glow of my studio monitors. I waited, the hours dragging by, my nerves fraying with every creak of the old floorboards. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the phone rang. I stared at it, heart pounding, knowing exactly who was on the other end. I let it ring, counting each second, daring myself to ignore it. But the sound was relentless. I couldn't leave it unanswered. When I finally picked up, the voice on the line wasn't breathing anymore. It spoke. "Turn around." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, as if moving through water, I swiveled in my chair. The door to the booth was open. I knew for a fact I'd locked it when I started my shift. In the doorway stood a man I'd never seen before, his face partially hidden under a hood. He didn't say a word, just smiled, the kind of smile that told me he knew far too much. He raised a finger to his lips, as if we were sharing a secret. Then he turned and disappeared down the hall, his footsteps soft against the carpeted floor. The line went dead, and in the silence that followed, I realized the scariest part. He hadn't used the phone at all. Something about my reflection looked off. Not wrong, exactly, but unfamiliar. The way my face moved, just a second out of sync with the way I thought it should. I told myself it was exhaustion, too many late nights, too much time alone, but it kept happening. In the mornings, I'd catch my reflection lingering too long, as if waiting for me to leave the room. I'd blink, and for a split second, the person staring back at me didn't feel like me at all. It wasn't just the mirror in the bathroom, either. I began noticing it everywhere, in store windows and car mirrors, even in the reflection of my phone screen. The stranger always looked the same, me, but not quite. The expression would shift ever so slightly, just enough to make me doubt my own memory of how I looked a moment before. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, it didn't feel like imagination. One morning, while shaving, I leaned closer to the mirror. The stranger leaned closer, too, matching me perfectly until he didn't. His lips curled into a small, tight smile. I hadn't smiled. I stepped back, heart hammering, but the reflection stayed frozen for a second longer than it should have, holding that same unsettling grin before resetting, as if nothing had happened. That was when I knew something was wrong. I started avoiding mirrors, but it didn't help. The feeling followed me everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Every time I walked past a reflective surface, I felt the stranger's gaze pressing against my back, waiting for me to look. And then one night, I saw him outside of the mirrors. It was in a crowded part of town, near the corner of a busy intersection. I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, just far enough away to make me question what I saw. He was standing by a street lamp, wearing the same clothes I had on that morning, his posture eerily familiar. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe someone who looked like me. But then he turned his head, just slightly, and our eyes met. He knew. He didn't approach, didn't make a move. He just stood there, watching me the way I had watched my reflection for weeks. And as I stumbled back, the crowd moving around me like water, I realized I didn't feel alone anymore. Wherever I went, he would be there, waiting for me to notice him. That night, I locked every door and covered every mirror in my apartment, hoping that if I didn't see him, he wouldn't see me. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving through the hall outside my room. I froze, every muscle tense, as the footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I could hear my own breath, shaky and uneven, except it wasn't mine. There was another breath, steady, patient, coming from the other side of the door. The knob turned slowly, almost playfully, before falling still. I stayed motionless, listening to the silence stretch thin. And then, from just beyond the door, I heard my own voice. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.